Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight we have another story from a submission. Is actually, again, we covered a story not too long ago from a guy named Ryan. Well, here's another one of his stories. And I got two more. They're neat little stories, and we do want to cover a lot more submissions. Mainly because they're really cool. Nobody's actually heard them before. And it's more incentive for you guys to send them in. I mean, that's really what Effed Up Stories is about, is your stories. So we're going to cover them a lot more. We want you to send more in. So if you have an Effed Up story on the paranormal or whatever, maybe it's pictures, maybe it's video, we would like to get it. So you can send that to us on our official site, which is effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Go to the menu, submissions, fill out the form, submit. It'll get on the website, and most likely we will cover it in a podcast. So with that having been said, Ryan, and we're going to refer to him as R from here on out, not to confuse him with our co-host, Ryan. He's had a life peppered with paranormal phenomenon. Much like many of our people who submit their stories, their lives are peppered with it. So, before his story begins, and his story has to do with a dark mass that manifests in his room. But before he even starts his story, he makes a point to note that he's never used a Ouija board or anything of that nature. And he says the reason why is that he's grown up with a lot of strange activity, paranormal phenomenon. And he thought to himself, if he's had that many problems already, what on earth would happen if he dabbled in the occult? I mean, that's his own little snippet there.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
Yeah, and I don't really blame him. Although I'm kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum in that I relish in that stuff. I just never seem to have many experiences. But anyway, I digress. Into his story. So this, if you remember the last story, he mentioned that I can't remember what age he was. It was after this story took place, and he had his own room at that point. He had gotten his older brother's room. So this is before that story, and this is back when he had an older brother who was in the army, and he had a younger brother. And in this story, this is before his older brother had left, and he was sharing a room with his younger brother, which was, it was in upstairs at the end of the hall. Being young, and he admits, he was afraid of the dark. And I guess, just maybe he had an active imagination. But for all these different kinds of reasons, he didn't want to go to sleep. He pushed it as far as he could. He said his eyelids would be, crashing in on him. He'd keep them open as long as he could, and he just couldn't resist. So from his own words, sleepwalking actually runs in his family, at least in terms of him and his brother. So, he usually, I guess, like most people, his sleepwalking would just consist of. And I found this kind of funny how he said it was, just consists of silly things like peeing in the sink or walking around. So I don't know how common that is for you sleepwalkers out there, but.
Yeah, it's both myself and my brother sleptwalk or used to sleepwalk, and my cousin was a prolific sleepwalker, and peeing in weird places is a really common one.
My brother actually, now he wasn't a common sleepwalker, but I do remember when he was really young, he went to my mom's room, he pulled open one of the drawers in the bureau and pissed in it. And it was pretty funny, right? But anyway, so in this story, R is 14 at the time, and he said that would make his brother 10. So they had twin bunks, and instead of it being like bunk beds on top of one another, they were separated on opposite sides of the room. Actually, sounds like my brother and sister. Anyway, he always had to have the room door open. That was just his paranoia, I guess. He had to be able to see out there. And he also had to have his closet door closed. He said he had to do these things because, he would, hear unpleasant sounds or he'd see something strange. And, if the doors weren't in this specific way, that's when, he'd experience this stuff. So, and he does say that up to this point in his life, no one in his family has actually experienced any paranormal phenomenon. So I guess this is just, so far we can chalk it up to being kids with an overactive imagination. So here he is. He said every night, he's lying face up. The covers are so tightly tucked into the sides of his bed that when he gets up in the morning, his bed is usually still made, right? I mean, it's just tucked in so tight. And this story took place in winter. He said it happened in Texas, and he said in the winter in Texas, it usually only gets to be as low as about 30. But he had two really big, heavy blankets, and so he was fine. So anyway, eventually he does fall asleep, but it only lasts for about an hour or two. He wakes up, and he's feeling really strange, and he looks to his right, and he sees this figure standing next to him in the bed. And he puts on his glasses, and, he expects this to be his brother. He expects it to be his brother that had just, like, sleptwalked and, walk in there. And, he was right. It was his brother. But, he wasn't walking around like he usually does when he's sleepwalking. He was just standing next to his bed, and he was staring at him for, I guess what seemed like a long period of time. He said his expression was as if he was deep in thought. He was watching him sleep, but he was deep in thought. And so he spoke to him. He tried to wake him up. And he said, he did this for a good 5 minutes. But, he just, it wasn't getting through, So he put his hand on his brother's back, and, his intention was to direct him back to his bedroom. It was just another sleepwalking incident, something that may have happened 100 different times. No big deal, right? So he does this. He brings his brother back to his room, and then he goes back and he makes his bed, and he said he makes it with military folds. I don't know exactly what that is, but I'm guessing it's pretty tightly tucked. And he said he tucked himself in, in a way that it was impossible to undo, right? So he's like tied tightly to his bed. And he tries to fall back asleep, but he can't. He's just lying there, and he's looking at the ceiling fan and questioning how long, his brother must have been there staring at him. But it was his only brother, so he wasn't too paranoid. It was just kind of strange, I guess. So anyway, he's still wide awake. All this stuff is running through his head. And he said it felt like it was about a half an hour. And then all of a sudden, both of his heavy covers were pulled from the tucked places and he said like his bed was tucked in all the way to his shoulders. And he said it was pulled with extreme force from the foot of the bed, but it wasn't just pulled off of him. He said that both covers, and he said, now I don't understand what kind of blankets this is, but he says it must have weighed a good 30 pounds together. He said one was like really thick wool and the other was a hand crocheted blanket. But he said that they were pulled, and they were basically like, where the foot of the bed is? Well, he said that they were pulled right down into that little slit, like they were tucked in between where his mattress and his footboard is, right? And this would have happened in like a split second, like this really forceful, just whoop, and is tucked down in this little slit. And he said he sat up, and he was trying to ignore what this was, trying to ignore the possibility that this was something unordinary, we'll say. And he gets up and he looks and he finds that the blanket were so tightly jammed into this slot that he couldn't even pull the covers out of the space. I mean, it was just so tightly jammed in there. And he said, beside the footboard in front of in front of the window, there was which was right to the side of his footboard or whatever, was this obvious dark mass floating in front of the window, not a foot from where he was, trying to pull his covers from. And I just realized something. When I said earlier he was directing his brother to his bedroom, I meant to his bed. That's right, they were in the same room. Anyway, so he pulls this blanket, and it's so tightly jammed in there that he can't pull it out. And as he looks next to the footboard of his bed, they're floating, next to the window is this really, really obvious dark mass, okay? And it was so obvious to him because he almost couldn't see through it. I mean, it had a transparent quality to it, but it was like I guess like a black cloud, like a thick black cloud. And he said he was so terrified at this point because he felt that whatever this was, I guess it had to have been intelligent. He felt that that's how he put it in quotes, it wanted him to know that it was the cause of his covers being so tightly tucked in between the mattress and the footboard. So this was the thing that pulled the blankets off of him. He said it was almost as if it was trying to tell him that, he wasn't in control of his room. This thing was. And he said, he stared at this dark mass with his glasses on for, a good couple of minutes, and he said he was too scared to scream. He was, really helpless. And he said, he continued to stare at this thing for, at least 4 or 5 minutes, and eventually it went away. And, he goes on, that was the main part of the story, but he says, while his family... him and his family were watching TV downstairs not a month before like this all took place. He had also looked to the right of a staircase and watched for several seconds as what he described as a very tall man looking very much like Abe Lincoln walked from his back door up to the staircase, one step at a time. And he said he was wearing a dark pressed suit. Must have been, he assumed it to be tailored in the 18th century. And he said he wore a tall black hat. He's very thin. He didn't look like a ghost to him. He said it looked like a real person. He just watched this real person that looked very similar to Abe Lincoln walk up his stairs. He said it was full-figured, solid. And so like that's just another incident that he saw. So I really don't think that that's directly related, but I guess it just goes to reinforce, his admission that he's had many strange things happen to him. So I mean, discussing the, I guess the elephant in the room, the black mass, right? The black mass that pulled his sheets off of him. So the first thing I thought when I read this story is I thought about how people's, if you have a really strong emotional strong emotions, negative in particular, it's been said that you can manifest these thought forms. You can manifest these. You can manifest poltergeist. You can manifest dark.
Well, you manifest poltergeist-like activity.
That's right. Yeah.
Like it's like just a random lashing out of psychic energy.
Now, didn't David Weatherly, when we had him on our show, I remember he was writing a book on tulpas.
Yeah.
And didn't that have to do with?
Well, tulpas, they are thought forms. I think it's a part of a Buddhist, maybe Buddhist belief system, where the word tulpas come from. In North American society, I guess, or in North American mythology, that kind of thing we refer to as a thought form, and I think it's that's a relatively recent term. So tulpas, it's like saying Bigfoot and Yeti. It's the same thing, just that's the regionally specific names. One's brown and one's white, reflect its environment.
Yeah.
Tulpas, thought forms, again, they're one and the same. I think a major difference with tulpas, I do believe, I could be wrong here, is I think that there's generally a specific attempt made to create one.
Okay.
It's purposeful. It's a premeditated act where thought forms, not necessarily always, but they, what we refer to as thought forms in North America, tend to be accidentally created. I know there was an experiment that was done. Now, geez, this was a while back. I can't remember the name of the experiment, but it was a group of people engineered a story, a completely fictional tale about a woman who experienced some trauma and commit suicide. And together they were able to contact this thought form that they had created in this group using the same kinds of divination tools like seances and crystal balls and cards and Ouija boards. I think specifically they used Ouija board. And they were able to contact this completely fictional ghost that they had made up in this very focused, very detailed story. And that together they had, they were illustrating a theory, a specific theory that they had, and they were experimenting towards that. But I think that very clearly illustrates how a group can create a thought form.
Well, it does seem like, and I've ironically been emailed at least by 2 or 3 different people in the last month, speaking about your frame of mind, right? Like the things that you think about, your attitude, if you're pissed off all the time, it seems like bad things keep happening to you, right? Like you kind of go in this downward spiral, and just by your frame of mind and the way you think, you attract either negative energy or positive energy. And honestly, in my own experience, I found this to be true, right? Like if you're having a particularly bad week, you have a really bad day at work, or maybe you're kind of depressed right now in this point of time in your life, it seems like just more bad luck seems to follow you. More things don't go your way, and it just keeps spiraling and getting more out of control. And in the opposite of that is also true. If you've had a particularly good couple days, and things just keep tending to line up your way. I even find that to be true if you're playing cards with people. You're on a winning streak and you're in a good mood because you're winning, right? And you might lose a game or two, but as long as you keep that positivity, you're having a good time, you're genuinely happy, and you're winning, it's like it keeps coming back, and you end up, for the most part, having this big winning streak. So, I mean, I've been emailed about this specifically. We've been getting a lot of emails from people in the past couple months when we took a break from our show. And, everybody kind of knows that trolling was why we took a break. And so a lot of people were basically saying that, fuck the trolls, a lot of people appreciate us and they like what we do and they're appreciative. And I have to say it to you guys who have email. I mean, there's been quite a few of you. You guys are awesome. I really have had a really renewed outlook and perspective, and just for all the negative stuff we've had, that we've got a lot of really truly amazing fans out there, and you guys are why we do this, and it's why we're going to continue to do it. But anyway, the point being that a lot of people touched on that very subject, like I guess they could tell. We were burnt out. I mean, you and I both said, Ryan, we were burnt out. I mean, we went the extra mile. We did lots of extra shows.
Well, I think that's exactly what it was, is that we were pre-recording a lot of material. We were dealing with a lot in our day-to-day lives. And everything all together, the trolling, of course, being but it certainly did seem to create a specific atmosphere, didn't it?
It did, like and I mean, something that I try to say, like, some people know, but you and I, both of us have very busy jobs, and in particular, we're both short-staffed. We're both picking up a lot of slack, working longer hours and stuff. So it's actually hard to find time to do the show, right? And then when we actually get some time to do it, we're so exhausted from that week of work. I mean, I've been working 6-day weeks sometimes here. And so you're so exhausted. It's like, even if you do have a couple hours after you get your grocery shopping and stuff done, you don't necessarily want to go and do a book report, right? I mean, I love this stuff, but it's hard to find time. So, a lot of people were concerned about stuff like that, and they were just telling us that they appreciate us, and I love you guys for that. But again, one of the things that kept popping up was, people, I guess, who are really in tune to this, they're knowledgeable on it, and they know, is that when you're focused on certain things, if you're focused on the negativity and stuff like that, you can really impact what you draw into your life. And I mean, Ryan, if you want to look at, and I hate to bring up an old eyesore, but and we mentioned this in our demonic possession episode, but we were, we had a guy that we were friends with that shit really went in a sour way, and we both directed a lot of negative energy towards him, and he fell apart, right? We know that a lot of things just really dramatically fell apart, and that would be one thing. You could chalk it up to coincidence, but I've found that to be true for several people who have, for lack of better words, affected me in a negative way. Anyone who's drawn my ire, I don't have to do, I don't do spells, I don't do shit like that. All I have to do is really focus and concentrate, and I don't even try it. It's just, it's intuitive. It's just what you do when you're mad at somebody. And some of those people who really drew it from me have had a lot of really dramatic, like life-changing bad stuff happen to them. And sometimes when I think about that, and I think about just the way nature works, because we do know that there is truth to the, your thought projection, okay? I mean, that's how we think miracles work. It's not a miracle of God necessarily when, somebody's saved from a terminal illness because a clergy prayed and God granted it. It was granted because they might have had a couple hundred people praying and focusing on that person getting better. Do you know what I mean?
Well, and there have been very specific studies that prove that, double-blind studies that, and it didn't matter who they were praying to. They even got a bunch of agnostics and straight disbelievers in any kind of divine anything, and they performed this double-blind study with a bunch of fertility clinics, and they proved these huge upticks in their results. That it certainly did look like that the praying was working, and I think you bring up a good point when you say, you don't do spells. Well, I mean, the ritual that's involved in what is classically known as a spell, with all the tools and sometimes even the ingredients, it's in my personal opinion and experience, it's actually meant to create a atmosphere, and that atmosphere is what helps focus your personal will on the matter, right? And it's that very specific focusing of your own strength, depending on your own personal strength of will. Sometimes these same kinds of things that an individual can do, a group can do as well. And I think that's what we get when it's, pray for a miracle and something amazing happens. If you're able to get large groups of people aligning their collective wills towards a specific goal. And, I think anybody should be able to absorb that. It doesn't seem like that ridiculous of a concept, that the power of the mind,
I think you're exactly right, and that's what I think. So, I mean, would it be fair then to say that, the whole, okay, somebody pisses you off, you get angry. Naturally. I mean, it's just natural. So even subconsciously, you direct that negativity towards that person, and maybe some bad stuff happens to that person as a cause of that. And is that not nature's balanced way of, evening things out? Right? I mean, does that make sense? Is that nature's way of, like, you were a dick, you did something bad to somebody, and now they're pissed off at you, and just them being pissed off at you, for lack of a better term, justifies, it gets justice on you in some way or another.
Well, it's all energy. We look in any kind of the sciences, whether it's material science or thermodynamics or chemistry, biology. We have all these different systems, whether it's chemical or biological or geological, or just general physics. All these energy systems find ways to balance energy. The discharge of electricity, water flowing from a high point to a low point. This is how our universe is laid out. And when you put energy into some sort of aggressive attack or something on somebody, well, I mean, that energy it just doesn't go out and dissipate into nothing. It like every other system, it moves on, it travels, it goes through processes. And I think, as far as nature is concerned, people may not be able to kind of get their head around the idea of nature, but think of it more of a natural system. It just, that's the way our universe is set up. Energy flows around. You reap what you sow sometimes.
You know what? That is a good way to summarize it. So, I guess if you're having a really, and I notice this for myself, right? Like, you can tell me, Ryan, if this is true for you, but when you're having a string of bad shit happen, it seems like it just continues and continues and continues. And just like when you're having, a string of good things happen, it continues. And I think in some ways our attitudes and just the way we feel has a big part in, the momentum of what's happening.
Well, yeah, I find I take the wind out of that kind of constant negative feedback just by, you just kind of like, all right, fuck it. I accept what's happening, and I'm just going to deal with it and move on. And the more I'm able to do that, the more it seems I'm able. You get yourself out of the funk, as it were.
Yeah, like you almost have to turn the other cheek, or decide to do something positive with it. Like, I'm going to take all of this anger and frustration and use it as a fuel to do something good with it. I'm going to use it to motivate me to do something difficult or whatever. You're going to use it as a fuel. So, I guess trying to wrap this back into how it relates into how his story was with the thought form, it's been said that your attitudes and your, even if you're not aware of it, right? A lot of poltergeist-like activity actually comes from I can't pronounce the word.
Prepubescent.
Teenagers, especially females, right? Because they're especially hormonal.
I think more specifically, a lot of it is found in houses where kids are going through puberty.
Yes.
They're entering, that kind of mental turmoil and I guess biochemical turmoil that takes place for people at that age.
So in our story, he's 14, and you got his little brother, he's 11. So, both of these kids are really around that age. Depending on when you hit that stage in your life. So you got both of these kids. You got, just the anxiety of for I guess he'd be like 1 year in junior high. You'd have the other kid, about to start junior high. You got the trials of school life and other kids and whoever knows what else could have been in their home life and in their neighborhood and stuff, all compounded by puberty. And just by reading our stories, he's heard some strange stuff, seen some strange stuff. He was a spooked little kid. He kept the lights on, had to have the doors a certain way. So, is it possible that, these emotions and stuff like that could have manifested this cloud of darkness, right? And in fact, perhaps a lot of the experiences that he had as a kid, I got 4 stories from him here now. We've covered one already. Maybe a lot of this stuff could be directly tied to, his thought forms. Is that possible?
Well, I certainly think there's a possibility. Also, it could very well be that it's a how do they say, a confluence of events, or you have an area that is prone to, whether it's electromagnetic or maybe something a little more exotic that we don't quite understand. A thinner area of the dimension. Perhaps the barriers are a little lower there, mixed with a strong-willed young man, trying to digest the conflict in himself, becoming, going from child to adult. It creates a lot of heavy-duty emotion. And like you said, we don't know what his home life was at this point, but I think it's safe to say that anybody 14 years old is going through some stuff.
Oh, hell yeah.
So I think it's definitely very possible that it was, either a series of thought forms or a series of thought forms accompanied by something else.
Well, do you know what I think it is? And I'm just giving an opinion. I really don't have any factual anything to this. But as is the case of what I was saying before, but how you react to certain things and your attitudes and stuff like that can more or less put you downward spiral or just draw in more of the same kind of energy or you know what I mean, the same kind of events. I think in R's case, he's probably had a couple, strange experiences. I mean, he did say he saw and heard some stuff. He was probably in tune to it from that. He was open to it, even at a young age. And as he experienced small things and he thought about it, he opened the possibility for more of it to happen. Much like your attitude can draw in, if you're negative, you're going to draw in negative things. Well, if you're really, you're open to the idea of the paranormal and you're thinking about it and you're worried about it and you're scared about it, you're open to it, you believe in it, and now you're drawn in more of it because you've opened your eyes to that world. You're thinking about it. You're directing that energy to you. So I think in our case, I mean, let's just say, for example, everything paranormal. Let's assume that it's all a real thing. He would have drawn more of it to himself because the little stuff that he did see and he did believe opened his mind to the possibility even more so. Now he could see more of it. Now he drew more of it. So I think in R's case, maybe at a young age, he opened that doorway and he fed it. He even if it was by an accident, his own subconscious mind, his own belief systems allowed it to be, and he drew it to himself. So that's what I think happened in his case. And what are your thoughts? Audience out there, if you want to give us your thoughts. I mean, if you have any experiences with that stuff, I'd be interested to hear it. And of course, if you have any of your own effed up stories on the paranormal or whatever, you can certainly send that to us as well. It'll get on the website and most likely into one of these podcasts. So you can submit that to us at our official website. That's effedupstories.com, EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. And I hope you enjoyed the story, and we do have more coming. We will be covering the Giants very shortly. And with that said, Ryan, do you have anything to add?
No, just, again, thank you very much for the continued support of all of our listeners out there. We really appreciate the nice comments, and it's really great to have people who are so interested in the material that we cover. Thank you for listening.
Oh, and a quick note, just because I forgot to mention it. For anybody who has commented on YouTube, I did disable the comments, but it only seems to apply to our newer videos because of the trolling. So if you don't see my reply to your comments, honestly, I'm ignoring them just because I don't want to go in and see the trolling things either. I know we got a lot of great fans out there, but the more popular our stuff gets, unfortunately, the more trolls that come in there. And the only way for me to keep my sanity and kind of keep this thing going is to just ignore that. So if you really have something important that you want to discuss with me, do it through our website. There's contact information on there. There's forums and stuff that you can do it through there. And that way, hopefully, we can both have our cake and eat it too. But with that said, thank you guys for listening, and we will catch you next time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight we have another story from a submission. Is actually, again, we covered a story not too long ago from a guy named Ryan. Well, here's another one of the stories. And I got two more. They're neat little stories, and we do want to cover a lot more submissions. Mainly because they're really cool. Nobody's actually heard them before. And and it's more incentive for you guys to send them in. I mean, that's really what Effed Up Stories is about, is your stories. So we're going to cover them a lot more. We want you to send more in. So if you have an effed up story on the paranormal or whatever, maybe it's pictures, maybe it's video, we would like to get it. So you can send that to us on our official site, which is effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES. He could, and he just couldn't resist. So, from his own words, sleepwalking actually runs in his family, at least in terms of him and his brother. So, he usually, I guess, like most people, his sleepwalking would just consist of, and I found this kind of funny how he said it was, just consist of silly things like, peeing in the sink or walking around. So I don't know how common that is for you sleepwalkers out there, but
Yeah, it's both myself and my brother sleptwalk or used to sleepwalk, and my cousin was a prolific sleepwalker, and peeing in weird places is a really common one.
My brother actually, now he wasn't a common sleepwalker, but I do remember when he was really young, he went to my mom's room, he pulled open one of the drawers in the bureau and pissed in it. And it was pretty funny, right? But anyway, so in this story, R is 14 at the time, and he said that would make his brother 10. So they had twin bunks, and like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Blame him, although I'm kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum in that I relish in that stuff. I just never seem to have many experiences. But anyway, I digress. Into his story. So this, if you remember the last story, he mentioned that I can't remember what age he was. It was after this story took place, and he had his own room at that point. He had gotten his older brother's room. So this is before that story, and this is back when he had an older brother who was in the Army, and he had a younger brother. And in this story, this is before his older brother had left, and he was sharing a room with his younger brother, which was, it was an upstairs at the end of the hall. Being young, and he admits, he was afraid of the dark. And I guess, just maybe he had an active imagination, but for all these different kinds of reasons, he didn't want to go to sleep. He pushed it as far as he could. He said his eyelids would be, crashing in on him. He'd keep them open as long as .com. Go to the menu, submissions, fill out the form, submit. It'll get on the website, and most likely we will cover it in a podcast. So, with that having been said, Ryan, and we're going to refer to him as R from here on out, not to confuse him with our co-host, Ryan. He's had a life peppered with paranormal phenomenon. Much like many of our people who submit their stories, their lives are peppered with it. So, before his story begins, and his story has to do with a dark mass that manifests in his room. But before he even starts his story, he makes a point to note that he's never used a Ouija board or anything of that nature. And he says The reason why is that he's grown up with a lot of strange activity, paranormal phenomenon. And he thought to himself, if he's had that many problems already, what on earth would happen if he dabbled in the occult? I mean, that's his own little snippet there.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
Yeah, and I don't really